Factories are an investment into product. Advertising is an investment into brand. Both are on the balance sheet as assets, although they are treated differently. So why are they dealt with differently when it comes to investment? Hi, I'm Ian Whittaker. As an analyst, I've been invited by JCDecaux to bring to you key pieces of macroeconomic research, an insight that gives senior marketeers the guidance and practical advice on how to plan marketing strategies to become change agents in your organization. Today, we're discussing some of the account practices around ad spend, and I'm delighted to, again, be interviewing Sam Tomlinson, PwC's media sector leader and founder of their multi-award-winning marketing and media assurance team. Welcome back, Sam. This is the second time we chatted on the podcast, and I think this is actually a topic that actually is quite important. I realise for many of the audience, they may be thinking, "Oh no, it's about accounting. Let's sort of dash out of the room." But actually, this is crucial when it comes to sort of both in terms of the way that advertising spend is framed within an organisation, and also as well getting the buy-in sort of key management members, including the CFO and also as well the board in general. One of the things I'd written about in the Pause of Play report was to say that advertising should be treated as intangible capex. That essentially it is just as you invest in a factory to build a particular product that drives sales, so also as well when it comes to brand advertising in particular, firms invest in that in order to produce long-term sales. But obviously from an accounting standpoint, there are different ways in which the two are treated. So you've been a great accountant, and obviously having a lot of experience in this area, I thought I would turn to an expert to go through this. So maybe for the help of the audience, would you just explain the differences between, I guess, first of all, in terms of how advertising spend is treated, both in terms of the balance sheet and then also as well when it goes through the profit and loss account. And then maybe also as well talk about the differences between OPEX and CAPEX and sort of where the key differences lie.
Yeah, so let's start with OPEX versus CAPEX, or operating expenditure versus capital expenditure. Operating expenditure is those costs that are reflected within your operating profit. And that means that you recognise those costs in the year in which they're incurred. Capital expenditure is those items that are deferred to the balance sheet, either as a tangible asset, like a factory, or an intangible asset, like some sort of intellectual property. And that is then, if it's a tangible asset, it is depreciated over a number of years. If it's an intangible asset, it's amortized over a number of years. And one of the important things here is that the analyst and investor community, when they are looking at a business's results, they often focus on measures of profit that exclude depreciation and amortization. So a classic one would be EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. And what that would mean is that if your costs have been treated as OPEX, your EBITDA will be lower. If they've been treated as depreciation or amortization, your EBITDA will be better because it excludes those amounts. And those amounts are spread over a number of years, which gives you a further benefit, even with your statutory operating profit. The reason people focus on EBITDA is it's used as a crude proxy for cash flow within the year.
Yeah, exactly. And going on that point in terms of the OPEX and the need for many firms, they look at EBITDA as a key metric. This, of course, when it comes to advertising, does create an incentive for many companies' managements to, if they need to protect profitability or boost profitability, to look at advertising spend as an area to cut, just because of the way that it's treated.
Ideally, what a CFO would like to do is to capitalize this type of expenditure as an intangible. The definition of an intangible is an identifiable non-monetary asset without physical substance that is either separable or controlled through contractual and legal rights. Now, on the face of it, brands would satisfy that nature of an intangible. The problem is that the relevant accounting standard, IAS 38, also goes on to say that you can only capitalize an asset if you can reliably measure its cost. And the challenge here and it then specifically says you cannot capitalize an internally generated brand. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of factors that go into building your brand. It's not just your marketing spend. The standard setters have determined that it's very hard to understand what aspects of the spend have contributed to the cost of building that brand, therefore expense the lot.
Yeah.
The only time that changes is when a company acquires another company. When a company A acquires company B, the brand is then separated out and capitalized as an intangible and amortized over a number of years. So when you look at a balance sheet, the first thing to think about is if I see a brand, that's because this company has acquired another one.
Yeah.
If the brand's been generated internally, it won't be on the balance sheet. What that then means is that therefore, all of your brand marketing expenditure and all of your performance marketing expenditure has to be expensed in the period in which it's incurred. And that, I think, causes two problems for CFOs. The first is, since it can't be capitalized, they're kind of inherently suspicious about, is there really a long-term benefit here? Why aren't I allowed to capitalize it? And then the second, more prosaically, is I need to hit my target this year. All of my marketing spend is going through my profit and loss as an operating cost in this year. That's one of the few levers that I've got that I can cut back to hit my profit target. In contrast, a lot of my tech spend is being capitalized. So that's not going to help solve my problem this year. It's a fundamental difference between tech cost and marketing cost.
And it's amazing actually in terms of the incentives, as it were, how the incentives are built into the system, how that much influences behavior as to what actually look at. It's not necessarily, and I know this from my own experience and completely sort of know what you're talking about, because when sort of companies are looking to meet targets, there is a lot of pressure from investors and shareholders to say, if you don't meet this target, this is negative against your share price, is negative against the management and so forth. I mean, we'll come on in a moment just to what potentially advertisers, marketers can do to maybe mitigate some of those issues. I guess one quick question I would have, and I already think I know the answer to this, but I'd like it confirmed by an expert, is one obvious question would be, would there be any chance, is there any sort of talk about the accounting standards being changed to at least sort of for brand advertising, sort of think about it more as an investment rather than necessarily a operational expenditure?
It's a really good question. And you can kind of see that the accounting rules were developed really with a mindset of physical factories, physical goods. Therefore, we capitalize that because that's real. We put that on the balance sheet. In today's world, where actually virtually all of the most valuable companies in the world today don't have factories. They've mostly outsourced. To the extent they even have hardware, they've mostly outsourced the actual hardware build. The most valuable companies today are built off intellectual property. But that's not how the accounting standards are today. And to the best of my knowledge, that's not how they're going to change in the near future. So I think we are left with a world where we all know marketing spend and advertising spend has long-term value. We can't capitalize that under the current accounting rules. And therefore, we need to think about other ways of conveying to analysts and investors the long-term value that is the return from that spend.
And I realise for many of the listeners that maybe listening to this and thinking, well, that's great about the accounting standards. But I think we can both agree on this point that unless you understand the incentives and the processes that actually underlie a firm's decisions, you may think that you actually have something which is a very solid argument, but actually unlikely to get anywhere with this. So, with that in mind, what can advertisers and marketers do in order when it comes to that conversation, with the CFOs, with the boards, potentially in situations as well, like with now, there's a lot of supply cost pressure, input costs obviously going up with inflation and so forth. There may be a temptation that comes through from companies to think, where can we actually look to cut spend, and advertising, as we've talked about, it's a way to actually meet your targets. Also as well, it's something that we can come back quickly. What would be the sort of tools that advertisers and marketers can use to persuade boards and company managements, look, this actually is a long-term investment. This is why we need to continue to do this?
Great question. I would tend to think of this in two stages. I think step one is convincing your CFO that your investment in marketing has genuine long-term value, as well as providing short-term benefits on that year's sale. So step one is convincing your CFO and the rest of the board. Then step two is arming your CFO and CEO and head of investor relations with the information, the arguments, the data points that they need to convey that message to the investor and analyst community. So maybe we start with convincing the CFO first.
Yeah, exactly.
So we talked a bit in our previous podcast about econometric modeling. Now, econometric modeling is effectively a way of understanding the drivers of demand for your products and services. And it's built off, rigorous mathematical and statistical techniques. That is stuff that a CFO can probably get on board with. One of the keys here in our experience is ensuring that econometric modeling is not owned solely by the marketing team. Internally, if your econometric modeling is owned by the marketing team and it comes back saying marketing is great, everyone else rolls their eyes. If you have it owned by somebody in finance or somebody in procurement, or potentially jointly owned, so that it is genuinely joint input from finance, procurement, marketing, strategy, other stakeholders, then the results will be more readily accepted by your internal stakeholders, particularly the CFO. The CFO then can start to recognize, okay, I've got some rigorous mathematical statistical modeling. It's by somebody I trust. It's been jointly owned and funded by the organization. And it is showing me that, sure enough, my marketing has a short-term and a long-term benefit. And therefore, if I don't invest in marketing, or if I only invest in short-term performance marketing, that will have a detrimental effect on my sales over the next 2 to 5 years. And assuming the CFO intends to be in role for that long, that will cause him a problem in the future. So that's getting the CFO on board.
Okay. And there's one that's a very interesting sort of answer, because there's a couple of other questions that come from that. And one that sort of immediately springs to mind is we work with financial models sort of all the time. And one of the things I always find quite frustrating is this whole idea that you hear from people outside, well, the model says this, and sort of, we say, well, it's not really sort of the model that counts, it's actually the inputs into the model that really are the critical point here. So maybe sort of if we could talk a little bit sort of about that, the importance really of the quality of the data, how it's framed, sort of, and how to deliver the best results.
Yeah, model structure and model data. So econometric modeling done well needs to start with an understanding of what are the different factors that drive demand for your products and services. And that partly is marketing, but it also includes macroeconomic conditions, regulatory environment, competitor activity, sponsorship, price promotions, all of that needs to be included, as well as your advertising. You need to understand the consumer journey. So thinking through, how does your consumer, how do they generate the awareness? How do you build that awareness? What are the different paths to purchase? And then you've got to make sure that the data sets that reflect each of them are complete and accurate. And you do need to think really hard about what data you can gather, how accurate is it, what's its frequency, what's its granularity, does it need cleansing? The actual application of the econometric algorithms is only a small fraction of the end-to-end project, if you like.
Yeah, and I think that's sometimes does get missed in the sort of in the wash here, is exactly sort of the importance there of all the other steps that need to be taken on that. I mean, one of the themes that is sort of explored in this series is the need also as well for advertisers and marketers to speak the language of the CFO, that speak the language of the board, and it can be somewhat sort of it can be as though sort of the two sides are speaking entirely different languages, and it can be difficult to explain. I mean, there's been plenty of work done, particularly by the FT and the IPA, talking about how brands, or rather boards fundamentally get the importance of brands, but where they struggle on is actually seeing, as it were, the quantitative evidence for that. And part of that seems to be around the fact that for advertisers and marketeers aren't necessarily speaking the language of what boards are used to hearing. Are there any thoughts on there, sort of from what sort of any tips or suggestions that you could give in terms of to advertisers and marketers?
Yeah, so I talked a minute ago about econometric modeling, showing long and short-term effects. Mm-hmm. That's really important. Even once your CFO is convinced, they need to be able to convince the investor and analyst community. Mm-hmm. And that community typically talks in terms of things like discounted cash flows, net present value. They want to understand what does having a stronger brand actually mean? Mm-hmm. And actually, this then should play to the strength of the marketeer, because if the marketeer can show invest now, mm-hmm. this year, next year in our brand, that will improve, that will provide a long-term benefit mm-hmm. by increasing our base sales. Mm-hmm. You can then start to extrapolate that out, take it out to perpetuity, discount back to present value. You've then got like a 20-year return on your marketing spend, not just an in-year return on your marketing spend. So provided marketeers can get comfortable with things like DCFs, NPVs, mm-hmm. time value of money, it actually opens up a chance to show much greater returns mm-hmm. than you would otherwise see.
And this is going back to this point. I mean, often ROI gets mentioned as the metric, and seems to be the only metric that is discussed. But you and I, coming from a sort of financial background, so sort of we tend to look at these things in a slightly different way, and maybe could just discuss that for a moment in terms of where the areas where ROI might be more appropriate and the areas where DCF or net present value may be a bit sort of appropriate. And maybe I think for discounted cash flow, net present value, maybe sort of people don't sort of realize that not everyone's going to be sort of au fait with some of the terms. So maybe a brief outline there of what exactly sort of that particular model is. But maybe start off on the ROI, where my view on the ROI model is it's probably most suited to an activation style spend, where it's very short term. It's very like, this is what you want to deliver right now.
Yeah. So I would agree. ROI is broadly, if I spend £100 on advertising this month, what will my sales go up by? That's my return on investment. Except it isn't quite, because your return on investment is actually your profit on those sales, not the actual sales value themselves, which is something that's also often missed. So, ROI really should be the profits I will generate in the short term from effectively performance marketing. With the caveat that we all know, separating performance from brand marketing, if it's done well, it has, halo effects in both directions. But ROI is short-term profits on, performance marketing activities.
Okay. And with the discounted cash flow model, it's a time value of money. It's talking about long-term investment. It's really discounting those cash flows back, take into account. And it's a pound now is worth more than a pound in the future just because of the time value of money and so forth. But it's more suited as a metric really for valuing brand advertising, just simply because it takes into account the longevity of the brand nature.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Typically when you're valuing a brand or a business, you would look at future cash flows. Mm-hmm. Typically you would model your sales or your revenues over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. You would also model the costs, both your operating costs and your capital expenditure, because that is a cash cost too. Yeah. So you'd map out your sales over the next 5 years, your OPEX and your CAPEX over the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. That gives you your profit. Then you recognize that actually your business will hopefully be going for much longer than 3 to 5 years. So you take those cash flows out to what's called perpetuity, but in practice, it's over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And then to your point, you need to recognize that a pound tomorrow isn't as worth as much as a pound today because of the effects of interest rates and inflation, and certainty. Yeah. You want money now more than you want it. The more you want the same amount of money.
Everyone's that.
In the future years. Yeah, exactly. We want money now. And therefore what you do is you discount those cash flows back to what they are worth today. And typically what you find is that 20-year time horizon, any profit that would accrue from after that, by the time you've discounted it back today, it's basically worthless. Yeah. And so you're basically looking at 3 to 5 years of actual cash flows, extrapolate out to 20, discount back to present value. That is what your business or your brand is worth today. And that then really plays to brand marketing.
Yeah.
Because that brand marketing, you will receive the benefits over many years, not in the current period.
Yeah. And intuitively, it all makes sense, sort of in terms of how we look at brand advertising and so forth. So when actually look at sort of, I guess in summary, when we look at sort of all of this, actually advertisers and marketeers there are a number of tools they have there to help persuade boards and managements to really continue sort of investing in advertising and marketing, even when temptation sort of is to cut it off. I guess also as well, one of the factors, and we touched on it in previous questions as well, is I guess one question would be the importance of continuing with ad spend even in times of recession. Because again, this is, going back to that point before, temptation is very easy just decide to cut and say it's an easy way to actually keep profitability up. But I think we can both agree that that's probably not the best attitude, especially with brand advertising.
Yeah, that's a great point. I guess, what are the tools we've touched on so far? It's econometrics, it's the right language, and it's understanding the psychology of the CFO that they have a profit target to hit that year. Mm-hmm. And a lot of their spend is either fixed or it is capitalized, if it's tech. And therefore marketing is a natural lever. It's not malicious. It's a natural lever to pull because it's one of the few levers. When times are tough, particularly when they're macroeconomically tough for everyone, clearly advertising and marketing will come under pressure. We saw this during the first COVID lockdown. The really smart brands actually continued spending. Some of them ramped up their spending during that first lockdown period because the really smart brands recognized that demand for advertising will be low because everyone else is trying to conserve cash. Yeah. The laws of supply and demand therefore mean that advertising will be really cheap because nobody else is demanding. That's then reinforced by the fact that right now everyone's stuck at home in front of their TV. Yeah. So TV advertising in particular was the cheapest it's ever been. Roughly speaking, in the first lockdown, you had audiences were up about 20%, I think, demand for advertising down 50%. Right. That's a 70% price benefit. The most sophisticated advertisers took full advantage of that. And typically these were brands like, for example, advertisers like the big consumer packaged goods groups. Because CPGs, literally they're selling their brand. They are selling their brand. So they've always known how important brand advertising is. Yeah. So they doubled down on their advertising in many cases. They certainly didn't look to drastically cut it. And if other advertisers can start to adopt some of that mindset, it is an investment. It will pay off in the medium term. And if others are cutting, that's a really good time for me to be spending. Like, that will really help those brands that hold their nerve.
I think that's a really, really great point to end on, sort of with that. And I think, the key message here is that for advertisers and marketers, I wouldn't say don't despair. Maybe that's too...
Absolutely.
But it is to say that actually, there are a lot of things there that you can use to actually push your case to CFO and boards. And I think it's important also to say that in many cases, those boards will be receptive. Yeah, absolutely. So thanks very much for that, Sam. That was absolutely superb. I'm sure there's going to be sort of plenty of questions people have. And sort of, if you don't mind people contacting you just in case, your email is sam.tomlinson@pwc.com. So please, people feel free, sort of if they need to. And again, thanks very much, Sam. We hope you enjoyed listening, and wherever you get your podcasts, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. For further resources, downloadable slides, and more information on all the topics covered in our podcasts, visit changemakers.jcdeco.co.uk. You'll also find my short e-learning series there on how to speak the language of the CFO on the JCDecaux Digital Academy. Thanks for joining, and see you next time.